Sara adjusted her makeup in the car mirror, her hands trembling slightly as she added a touch of lipstick. The reflection staring back at her was familiar but guilt-ridden. She hated lying to Jake, her husband of 8 years, but she couldn't seem to stop herself. There was something intoxicating about Ryan, her lover, the excitement, the danger, the escape from routine. She glanced at her phone. Ryan had texted her, "Almost there. Can't wait to see you." Sara sighed and started the car, driving to their usual meeting spot at a secluded park just outside of town. She convinced herself that she wasn't doing anything wrong, that everyone deserved a little freedom now and then. But deep down, she knew the truth. Unbeknownst to Sara, someone else had noticed the patterns in her schedule. Laura, her best friend since college, happened to be in the area that day, dropping off supplies for a community event. As Laura passed by the park, she spotted Sara's car parked near the edge of the lot. Curious, she slowed down, only to see Sara laughing with a man Laura didn't recognize. The two were seated on a bench, their heads close together, clearly more than friends. Laura's curiosity turned into disbelief, and then something darker. Pulling out her phone, she snapped a quick photo before driving away, her mind buzzing with possibilities. Sara returned home that evening to find Jake in the kitchen, stirring a pot of spaghetti. His easy smile greeted her as she set down her purse. "Hey, babe," Jake said. "How was your day?" "Fine," Sara replied, forcing a smile. "Just the usual errands." Jake kissed her cheek, oblivious to the turmoil churning inside her. Sara watched him stir the sauce, guilt gnawing at her. She loved Jake, but somewhere along the way, their spark had dulled, replaced by routine and predictability. Ryan was her escape, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her double life was on the brink of collapsing. Later that night, as Sara prepared for bed, her phone buzzed. She frowned, picking it up to see a text from Laura. "We need to talk. I know what you've been up to." Sara's blood ran cold. Her hand shook as she typed a reply. "What are you talking about?" Laura's response was instant. "Don't play dumb. I saw you today. Meet me tomorrow, or I'll show Jake everything." Sara sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, her heart racing. She couldn't let Jake find out, not like this. Laura had always been her confidant, her closest friend. The betrayal stung almost as much as the fear of exposure. The next morning, Sara met Laura at a quiet cafe, her nerves frayed. Laura was already seated, her arms crossed and a smug expression on her face. "You're late," Laura said as Sara sat down. "What do you want?" Sara demanded, skipping pleasantries. Laura slid her phone across the table. On the screen was the picture of Sara and Ryan at the park. Sara's stomach dropped. "You're going to delete that," Sara said, her voice trembling. Laura smirked. "Not so fast. I think we can come to an arrangement." Sara's eyes narrowed. "What kind of arrangement?" "Let's just say you're going to do exactly what I tell you from now on," Laura said, leaning forward. "Unless you want Jake to see this." Sara's mind raced. She couldn't believe Laura was doing this to her. They had been through everything together. But the evidence on Laura's phone was damning, and Sara knew she had no choice but to agree. "Fine," Sara said through gritted teeth. "What do you want?" Laura's smile widened. "Oh, you'll find out soon enough." That evening, Sara returned home to find Jake in the living room, scrolling through his laptop. She forced a smile, pretending nothing was wrong. But her mind was spinning with Laura's cryptic words. What would she demand? Money? Something worse? Jake looked up, his brow furrowing. "You've been quiet all night. Everything okay?" Sara nodded quickly. "Yeah, just tired." Jake didn't press further, but Sara could feel his gaze linger on her as she moved around the house. She hated the growing distance between them, but she didn't know how to bridge it, not while she was trapped in this web of lies. The first demand came the next day. Laura texted Sara a shopping list of expensive items she wanted, from designer handbags to high-end makeup. "Have these delivered to my place by the end of the week," the message read. "And don't make me remind you what's at stake." Sara gritted her teeth, her frustration mounting. She couldn't afford to keep Laura happy forever, but the alternative, Jake discovering the truth, was unthinkable. As the days passed, Laura's demands escalated. She began asking Sara to fabricate arguments with Jake or to act strangely at home, just to see how far she could push her. "You're enjoying this," Sara accused during a tense phone call with Laura. "Maybe a little," Laura admitted with a laugh. "But you deserve it, don't you? After what you've been doing behind Jake's back?" Sara clenched her fists, fighting back tears. She was trapped, and Laura knew it. Jake, meanwhile, began to notice the changes in Sara. She seemed distracted, her behavior erratic. One evening, as they sat down to dinner, he said, "Is there something you're not telling me?" Sara's fork froze mid-air. "What do you mean?" "You've just been different lately," Jake said, his voice gentle but probing. "Distant. Like something's bothering you." Sara forced a smile. "I'm fine." "Really?" But Jake didn't look convinced, and Sara knew it was only a matter of time before her carefully balanced world came crashing down. Sara's life felt like it was spinning out of control. Laura's blackmail demands had turned her daily routine into a minefield. Every text from her former best friend sent waves of dread through her, and every moment at home with Jake was laced with fear of discovery. She barely recognized herself anymore, a woman living in constant fear, caught between her lies and her guilt. Laura's texts became increasingly invasive. "Wear that red dress Jake loves tonight, but make it clear you're not in the mood. Push him away. Let's see how long he stays clueless." Sara's stomach churned as she read the message. Laura's sadistic glee was evident in every word, but Sara had no choice but to comply. She slipped into the red dress after dinner and joined Jake on the couch, her mind screaming at her to find a way out of this mess. Jake reached for her hand. "You look beautiful," he said, his eyes warm. "Thanks," Sara replied, her voice barely above a whisper. When he leaned in to kiss her, she pulled away, feigning a yawn. "I'm just so tired tonight." Jake frowned but didn't push. Instead, he gave her a concerned look. "Is something bothering you? You've been so distant lately." Sara's heart broke at his words. She hated how her actions were hurting him, but Laura's threats loomed over her like a storm cloud. She forced a smile. "Just work stress," she lied. "It'll pass." The next day, Laura upped the stakes. She called Sara during lunch, her tone smug. "You're going to cancel your plans with Ryan," Laura said. "He's a distraction, and I'm not letting you juggle two men while you're under my control." Sara's grip tightened on her phone. "What does Ryan have to do with this?" she demanded. "Oh, I don't know," Laura said, feigning innocence. "Maybe I'm just curious to see how far you'll go to protect your precious secrets. Cancel, or I'll make sure Jake sees the picture tonight." Sara closed her eyes, her head pounding. She texted Ryan to cancel their evening plans, making up a flimsy excuse about a sudden work obligation. Ryan's reply was curt. "This is getting old, Sara. Call me when you've sorted your life out." At home, Jake's suspicion continued to grow. He noticed the way Sara avoided eye contact, her hesitance when answering simple questions. One evening, as they cleaned up after dinner, Jake leaned against the counter, watching her closely. "Are you sure everything's okay?" he asked. Sara forced a laugh. "Of course. Why wouldn't it be?" "I don't know," Jake said, crossing his arms. "You've just been acting different. Distant. Even Laura mentioned you've seemed off lately." Sara's blood ran cold. "You talked to Laura?" "Yeah, she came by the other day," Jake said. "She seemed worried about you." Sara's heart raced. Laura was laying the groundwork to expose her, framing herself as a concerned friend. Sara couldn't let that happen. She had to find a way to regain control. Laura's next move came 2 days later. She invited herself over under the guise of catching up. Sara had no choice but to play along, though the tension between them was palpable. "How have you been?" Laura asked sweetly as they sat in the living room. Jake was in the kitchen, within earshot. "Fine," Sara said through gritted teeth. Laura smiled, her eyes glinting with malice. "You've been so busy lately. I hope you're not overworking yourself. That wouldn't be good for your relationships." Sara's hands clenched in her lap. "I'm managing," she said, forcing a calm tone. Jake walked into the room, holding a tray of coffee mugs. "What are you two talking about?" he asked. "Just catching up," Laura said smoothly, taking a mug. "Sara's been under a lot of stress lately. You should keep an eye on her." Sara shot Laura a warning glare, but Laura ignored her, sipping her coffee with a satisfied smile. That night, Jake brought up the conversation again as they got ready for bed. "What did Laura mean about you being under stress?" he asked, his tone concerned. Sara scrambled for an answer. "She's exaggerating. You know how she is." Jake didn't look convinced. "Sara, if there's something going on, you can tell me. Whatever it is, we'll get through it together." Tears pricked Sara's eyes. She wanted to tell him everything, to confess and finally free herself from Laura's grip. But the image of Jake's devastated face stopped her. She couldn't do it. Not yet. The web tightened further when Sara found a handwritten note slipped under her front door the next morning. It was from Laura, written in bold, taunting script. "TikTok, Sara. The truth always comes out." Sara crumpled the note in her fist, her anger bubbling over. Laura was enjoying this too much, and Sara knew she had to find a way to stop her. But how? She couldn't think of an answer. All she knew was that time was running out. Sara's carefully balanced world was unraveling faster than she could manage. Laura's manipulation grew bolder, her demands more invasive, and Jake's growing suspicions made it nearly impossible for Sara to maintain her facade. She could feel the walls closing in, but she had no idea how to escape. Jake's unease had transformed into a quiet determination. He began observing Sara more closely, picking up on the smallest inconsistencies. When she'd claimed to be running errands, he'd find no evidence of purchases. When she said she was meeting friends, he'd casually text one of them only to receive a puzzled response. It didn't take long for Jake to realize that something was very wrong. One evening, after Sara had gone to bed, Jake decided to search her phone. It was something he'd never imagined doing, but desperation had pushed him beyond his usual boundaries. His hands shook as he scrolled through her messages, finding nothing incriminating at first. But then he stumbled upon a partially deleted photo in her gallery. The picture was blurry, but it was unmistakably Sara sitting on a bench with another man. They were close, too close. Jake's stomach churned as he stared at the image, his mind racing with questions. Who was the man? Why hadn't Sara mentioned him? And why was the photo partially erased? Jake put the phone down, his chest tight with anger and confusion. He needed answers, but he didn't want to confront Sara without more evidence. The next day, Jake took an unplanned day off from work. While Sara thought he was at the office, he used the time to dig deeper. He searched through their shared financial records, looking for anything unusual. His efforts paid off when he discovered charges for expensive meals and boutique shops, all on days when Sara had claimed to be busy with errands. Jake's heart sank further as the pieces began falling into place. Meanwhile, Laura's games continued. That afternoon, she sent Sara a text with a new demand. "Tell Jake you need a weekend away. I want you at my place by Friday night. And don't forget the gift I mentioned." Sara's frustration boiled over. She typed back furiously. "I'm done playing your games, Laura. You've made your point. Just delete the photo and leave me alone." Laura's reply was swift and chilling. "You don't get to make demands. Do as you're told, or I'll send the picture to Jake right now." Sara stared at the screen, feeling the weight of Laura's control pressing down on her. She had no choice but to comply. Later that evening, she casually mentioned to Jake that she needed a weekend to herself. Laura invited me to stay with her, Sara said, keeping her tone light. Just some girl time to unwind. Jake's eyes narrowed slightly, but he nodded. That sounds nice. You've been stressed lately. Maybe it'll help. Sara forced a smile, though her heart ached. She hated lying to him, but Laura's threats left her no other option. The weekend away at Laura's house was even worse than Sara had anticipated. Laura reveled in her power, making snide comments and issuing demeaning tasks for Sara to complete. At one point, Laura handed Sara a bottle of wine and told her to draft a fake apology letter to Jake. "Let's see how creative you can get," Laura said with a smirk. "I want to know what you'd say if you ever had to come clean." Sara's hand shook as she wrote, tears streaming down her face. She hated Laura with every fiber of her being, but fear kept her compliant. The weekend felt like a prison sentence, and by the time she returned home, she was emotionally drained. Jake, however, had spent the weekend conducting his own investigation. He decided to reach out to Laura directly, curious to see if she'd slip up or reveal anything about Sara's behavior. When he called, Laura's tone was overly friendly, but something about her answers didn't sit right with Jake. "How was the weekend with Sara?" he asked casually. There was a brief pause before Laura replied, "Oh, it was great. Just a lot of wine and girl talk, you know how it is." Jake's instincts told him she was lying. He decided to press further. "I'm glad she had a good time. She's been so stressed lately." "Did she say what's been bothering her?" Laura hesitated, then laughed nervously. "Oh, just work stuff. Nothing major." Jake thanked her and ended the call, his suspicions growing. Something was off, and he was determined to find out what it was. That evening, as Sara prepared dinner, Jake stood in the doorway, watching her closely. "You know, I talked to Laura today," he said casually. Sara froze, her back to him. "Oh? What about?" "Just checking in," Jake said, stepping closer. "She said you had a great time this weekend. Lots of wine and girl talk." Sara nodded, forcing a laugh. "Yeah, it was nice to unwind." Jake studied her carefully. "Sara, is there something you're not telling me?" Sara's heart raced. "Of course not. Why would you think that?" Jake's gaze hardened. "Because things aren't adding up. And I'm not going to stop until I get the truth." Sara's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the web tightening around her, and for the first time, she realized she might not be able to escape. Jake's quiet determination had grown into a simmering resolve. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, and while he didn't yet have the full picture, he could no longer ignore the inconsistencies in Sara's behavior. The emotional distance, the vague excuses, and the strange tension around Laura, it all pointed to something much bigger. Meanwhile, Sara's anxiety was at an all-time high. Laura's games had pushed her to the edge, and Jake's piercing questions were harder to deflect. She felt like a trapped animal, desperately searching for a way out of a cage that was shrinking by the second. The breaking point came one evening when Jake overheard a heated phone call between Sara and Laura. Sara had locked herself in the bedroom, but her raised voice carried through the thin walls. "I'm done, Laura," Sara hissed. "You've had your fun, but I'm not playing your games anymore." Jake's heart raced as he pressed his ear to the door, straining to hear Laura's response. "Oh, you think you have a choice?" Laura's voice was faint but laced with malice. "One word to Jake, and your perfect little life is over." Jake's blood ran cold. He stepped back, his mind reeling. Laura wasn't just involved in whatever was happening, she was orchestrating it. When Sara emerged from the bedroom, Jake was waiting for her in the living room. His expression was calm, but his eyes burned with intensity. "Who was that?" he asked, his voice steady. Sara froze, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. "What?" On the phone, Jake said. "Who were you talking to?" No one, Sara said quickly. Just a telemarketer. Jake stood, his height towering over her. Don't lie to me, Sara. I heard you. You were talking to Laura. Sara's face paled. Jake, I can explain. Explain what? Jake's voice rose, his frustration boiling over. Explain why my wife is sneaking around, lying to me, and letting her best friend blackmail her. Sara's breath caught. You don't understand. Then make me understand. Jake shouted. Because right now, all I see is the woman I thought I knew hiding something that could destroy us. Sara broke down, her composure crumbling under the weight of Jake's anger and her own guilt. Between sobs, she confessed everything, the affair with Ryan, the photo Laura had taken, and the relentless blackmail that had consumed her life. I never wanted to hurt you, Sara said, her voice trembling. I made a mistake, and Laura used it against me. I didn't know how to fix it. Jake's face was a storm of emotions, anger, betrayal, heartbreak. He turned away, running a hand through his hair as he processed her words. How could you do this? He finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. How could you betray me like this? Sara reached for him, but he stepped back. Jake, please? I'll do anything to make this right. Before Jake could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. They both froze, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. Are you expecting someone? Jake asked, his tone sharp. Sara shook her head, her heart pounding. Jake moved to the door and opened it to reveal Laura, standing on the porch with a smug smile. Evening, Jake, Laura said sweetly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. What the hell are you doing here? Jake demanded, his anger flaring again. Laura's gaze shifted to Sara, who looked like she wanted to sink into the floor. Oh, I thought it was time we had a little chat. All three of us. The confrontation that followed was explosive. Laura reveled in her control, laying out Sara's affair in painstaking detail while framing herself as the victim. I tried to protect her, Laura said, feigning sincerity. But she just couldn't stop lying. I thought you deserved to know the truth, Jake. Jake's fists clenched at his sides. You've been blackmailing her. Don't pretend you're innocent in this. Laura's smile faltered. I did what I had to do. Someone needed to hold her accountable. And you enjoyed every second of it, Jake shot back. Sara looked between them, her shame mounting with every word. I'm sorry, she whispered. I've ruined everything. The tension reached its peak when Ryan showed up unexpectedly, having been tipped off by Laura. His presence added another layer of chaos to an already volatile situation. You've got some nerve coming here, Jake said, his voice icy. I'm here for Sara, Ryan said, ignoring the hostility. She deserves better than this mess. Jake's temper snapped. Get out. Now. Ryan hesitated, but the fury in Jake's eyes left no room for argument. He turned and left without another word, leaving Sara to face the full weight of her choices. When the dust settled, Jake turned to Sara, his expression hard but resolute. We're done, he said quietly. I can't do this anymore. Sara's knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, her sobs echoing through the empty room as Jake walked away. Laura watched silently, her smug satisfaction replaced by something unreadable. The game was over, but the damage was done. The house was quiet after Jake left, the silence pressing in on Sara like a suffocating weight. She sat on the floor of the living room, her tears long since dried, staring blankly at the wall. The wreckage of her choices surrounded her, and the reality of what she had done was impossible to ignore. Laura stayed for a few minutes longer, her usual smugness replaced by an air of awkwardness. Well, she said finally, breaking the silence. I guess that's that. Sara turned her head slowly, her gaze piercing. You did this, she said, her voice hoarse. You tore my life apart. Laura raised an eyebrow. I didn't cheat on Jake. You did that all on your own. You enjoyed every second of it, Sara shot back, her anger rekindling. "You've been waiting for this, haven't you? To ruin me." Laura didn't deny it. Instead, she gave a small shrug. "Maybe. But you gave me the ammunition. Don't forget that." Without another word, Laura grabbed her purse and left, the door slamming shut behind her. For the first time in weeks, Sara was alone with her thoughts. Jake's absence was immediate and painful. The next morning, Sara woke to an empty bed and a cold, empty house. She knew he was staying with a friend, but the lack of his presence felt like a gaping hole in her chest. She spent the day in a daze, replaying their confrontation over and over in her mind. Meanwhile, Jake was processing everything in his own way. Staying with his friend Mark, he shared the full story for the first time. Mark listened quietly, his expression a mix of shock and sympathy. "What are you going to do?" Mark asked after Jake finished recounting the events. Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. Part of me wants to walk away and never look back. But another part," he trailed off, his voice heavy with emotion. "Another part still loves her," Mark finished for him. Jake nodded. "Yeah. Despite everything, I do." As the days turned into weeks, Sara threw herself into repairing the damage she had caused. She started attending therapy, both alone and as a couple when Jake agreed to join her. The sessions were raw and painful, forcing them to confront the cracks in their relationship that had been there long before her affair. "Why didn't you come to me?" Jake asked during one session, his voice filled with hurt. "Why didn't you tell me how unhappy you were?" Sara's eyes brimmed with tears. "I didn't know how. I was scared, and I felt like you wouldn't understand. But that doesn't excuse what I did." Jake nodded slowly, the pain evident in his expression. "No, it doesn't. But I want to try to move forward. I don't know if I can forgive you yet, but I'm willing to try." Laura, meanwhile, found herself increasingly isolated. Her involvement in Sara and Jake's marriage had left her with few allies. The friends she had once shared with Sara distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the role she had played in the betrayal. For the first time, Laura began to question whether her actions had been worth it. One evening, she called Jake, hoping to explain herself. "I'm not saying what I did was right," she said. But Sara needed to be held accountable. "You deserve to know the truth." "Maybe," Jake replied. "But you didn't do this for me. You did it for yourself." Laura was silent, unable to argue. Jake ended the call, feeling a sense of closure he hadn't expected. Months later, the scars of the ordeal were still there, but they had begun to heal. Jake and Sara's relationship was far from perfect, but they were making progress. They started rediscovering the things that had brought them together in the first place, rebuilding their trust one step at a time. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Jake reached for Sara's hand. She looked at him, surprised by the gesture. "I'm still hurt," he admitted. "But I don't want to lose what we've built. I want to try to forgive you." Sara's eyes filled with tears. "I don't deserve it, but I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you." Jake nodded, a faint smile on his lips. "Let's take it one day at a time." As for Laura, she moved away shortly after, her reputation in their social circle in tatters. Sara never heard from her again, but she often thought about her former friend, wondering if Laura had found peace or if she still carried the bitterness that had driven her actions. In the end, Sara and Jake's story was one of pain and redemption, of mistakes and second chances. While the road ahead was uncertain, they faced it together, determined to build a future stronger than the past that had tried to destroy them.